unearth it, and I don't think it's played in New York ever. Is that ish? Ish. It hasn't been announced. It's never been shown, but it's been announced officially. Anyway, but it's a real discovery. We're going to talk about it afterwards. Matt will be here, Kazembe will be here, Sekou Odinga, who's a Panther who's in Congo and in Algiers with Eldridge will be here. And to say a few words about this film, this rediscovery, here's Matt Peterson.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Jake, for inviting us. Thanks, everyone, for coming. As Jake mentioned, Kazembe and I and some other people here, we used to be part of a collective kind of radical cultural organizing group called Red Channels, and part of the work we did at the Breck Forum and other venues in New York City was to try to find kind of old, lost, hidden, mysterious, esoteric kind of documents, artifacts, media produced by radical movements. And necessarily that led us to things that were primarily happening in the 60s or 70s, in particular with 16mm film production, but of course also with video. And video was one of the things that was interesting to us. And I remember Kazembe and I talking at the Breck Forum about things that I think each of us had separately read about this film or this work that was rumored to have been worked on, which was the one the Black Panthers are based in Algiers, that they went to Congo and tried to make a film. And it was something that we read about, but we never heard about it being finished, and we never knew what it was, and there was never any traces of it at all. So it was kind of like one of those kind of holy grails or sort of missing things that we always dreamed of or imagined, but never actually thought were real, you know? But as Jake mentioned, in 2010, right around now, in July 2010, we curated or programmed together about a 2-week-long series called Contraband Cinema, which I was just looking over the program recently. It was kind of a remarkable, ambitious, sort of radical program that was at BAM, where Jake was working and programming before this beautiful space opened. And as he said, one of the things we programmed then, which was another actually a holy grail, which didn't screen very often, was William Klein's film on Eldridge Cleaver. So as he mentioned, we invited Kathleen out to dinner, and actually we should mention that that was July 4th, so it was over July 4th weekend, and we were thinking, you know, okay, it's July 4th in New York City, there are these sort of famous historical fireworks shows, what can we program that can compete with the fireworks? So he said, okay, what about this film about Eldridge Cleaver in Algiers, and we'll bring Kathleen, you know, maybe that'll be something that can compete. And there was more than 250 people there, it was totally sold out, it was kind of an enormous showing, and Kazembe and Kathleen had a discussion afterwards that was really great. But over dinner, you know, we kind of got up the courage to ask Kathleen, you know, hey Kathleen, you know, we have kind of a stupid question, but we read about this film. What happened, or what was it? She was like, oh, I think, you know, there was some well-known French filmmaker was helping edit it. And she's like, I don't really remember, but yeah, he was supposed to help edit it, and I don't know what happened, he lost it. And we were like, could it have been, you know, Chris Marker? And she's like, yeah, that's who it was, you know, like, he never finished it, I don't know what happened to it, you know, it was lost. But, by chance, you know, there's 3 different ways that we could think about kind of entering into this screening or this event or this discussion, one of which is Chris Marker and his body of work, which is the reason for the series, this occasion of this book or something about his studio. Another is Eldridge Cleaver and his life and the Black Panthers and their kind of international movement that was most famously based in Algiers. And the third would be Congo itself, the Congo Brazzaville movement itself, you know. And there's 3 different ways. But the Chris Marker thing, I had actually, fortunately, gotten to know Chris and met him in 2008 and visited the studio myself. So after Kathleen mentioned that it was him, that kind of it's his fault this film doesn't exist, I emailed him, and he sent me an email back, and I published it. I published the email around, you can Google it or something, most of the email. But he said he did finish it, and that he doesn't know what happened to it, and he's upset that he never kept a copy of it. But he's like, I finished it, it was great, it's their fault, I don't know what they did with it, but I finished it, I did a great job, you know what I mean? So that kind of revived, so we're like, okay, this film exists, it was made, it was edited, it was finished, now we can kind of resume or revive this idea of tracking it down and seeing where it might have ended up, basically. And yeah, there's a few different tracks and there's a few different things that I think are interesting to kind of consider about it, about the kind of the genealogy of it and this kind of convergence of different forces, basically. But one of the things is that it was video. It was made with video, and this was one of the early years of video, Sony Portapac. There was a couple living in Paris, Paul and Carole Roussopoulas, who were some of the first French filmmakers or artists or political people to work with video, and they had acquired a video camera, so they were kind of a ground zero for people who were interested in this new technology, among whom was Marker. Then there was a kind of a black photographer named Bill Stevens, who was responsible for shooting this, and he was living in Paris, he was a photographer, and he kind of found his way to Paul and Carole's house to experiment with some of this technology, and they had actually bought a video camera or invested in it at the suggestion of Jean Genet, and they made a film about Angela Davis together. And they made films about kind of radical movements, feminist movements throughout the 70s, and they were kind of worked collectively. So Bill Stevens, you know, he was one of the people, and he got to know, because he was an African American in Paris, he got to know Kathleen Cleaver through the children and the son of Richard Wright, actually.
Yeah, Julia Wright.
Yeah. So they kind of connected in Paris, this kind of expat community. And maybe people have saw or also read, but there was kind of, they used video as a sort of propaganda tool. And one of the reasons why we say we're not sure if it's finished or not, because in a way the video, the technology didn't totally work like that. You know, it's like you shot something, you shipped it out, they maybe showed it or didn't, they sent it back, they edited it along the way. So it's kind of unclear, you know. But the Black Panthers were sending from Algiers back to New York and to Harlem videotapes that they were releasing as kind of communiques or something, and they had this imaginative vision of using video and new media, new technology to communicate. And obviously, famously, they had the newspaper, which was one of the main ways they funded the Black Panther Party itself. So they were very kind of savvy to using media, was the way to communicate, to document ideas, etc. So. Just I wanted to give a few things for context, basically, because the film, it's kind of a little obscure and could be difficult if you don't really, if you don't have a strong sense of sort of where it's coming from. So basically, there were people who were traveling to Algiers. So back up. In April 1968, Martin Luther King's assassinated, and there's riots throughout America, basically. And in the Bay Area, there's kind of riots that the Panthers at the time got caught up in. And Eldridge Cleaver himself and Bobby Hutton is killed in a kind of shootout that happens here. And Eldridge Cleaver is charged with participating. So throughout, he's kind of released, freed on bail or whatever, and he's kind of floating around the United States in that kind of summer of 1968. And by November, there's another film that kind of is another interesting artifact, which is when Jean-Luc Godard came to the United States, he worked with Al Maisels and Pennebaker to make the film that basically becomes 1 p.m. And he films Eldridge Cleaver in November of 1968. And Eldridge Cleaver at the time is talking about how he has no intention or no plan to turn himself in to the authorities at this time. So in December, he kind of leaves the United States, and in December of 1968, he ends up in Cuba. And this is the kind of beginning of this sort of exile. But in Cuba, while he's in Cuba, the Cuban officials don't really want him to publicly announce or say that he's in Cuba. They don't want him to be like an agitator to the United States from Cuba. So he's there, but no one really knows he's there. He doesn't really appear publicly. There's no press statements or whatever. And they're kind of angling to get rid of him because they don't really want to deal with Eldridge Cleaver in Cuba. They actually are trying to arrange to send him to the Middle East to work with Palestinians, maybe in Jordan or something. And he's like a little skeptical of that. So they come up with a compromise. Basically, they're like, okay, we'll get you on a flight to Algiers. And they're like, all right. So 6 months later, he shows up in Algiers in June. And in July, there's a big press conference. And this is during the Pan-African Cultural Festival, which is a famous festival, which is why William Klein was in Algiers in the first place in 1969. So that's when this film that we shot, that we showed, at BAM, this film that William Klein made. So this is right at the very beginning time of Algiers, but in this time, lots of people are coming through Algiers, people involved in third world liberation movements from throughout the world, throughout Africa, Asia, etc. So within a year of him being based in Algiers, the government gives him an embassy. And what that does is creates people, former Black Panthers or people from wherever, they can show up or pop up in Algiers. And rather than being a kind of ragtag group of expats or refugees or whatever, they become the international section of the Black Panther Party. And they have a villa, they have a building that has a plaque, they have a staff, they have funding. So within this time, this is now 1970, people start coming. And this is, at the time when the New York 21 are kind of wanted and people start to leave, people are being kind of killed and harassed and put in prison throughout the United States, in particular New York. So a number of people start showing up in Algiers, whether they're hijacking planes or whatever. So more and more you have this kind of density or concentration, which becomes the international section, among whom is Sekou Odinga, who I think will join us tonight and participate in the discussion, who is a political prisoner for over 30 years, who was released a few years ago. So that'll be a real treasure and treat for us to be able to listen to him and talk to him about this. But while the international section is founded, it becomes an international phenomenon for people throughout the world who don't like the United States. They love the idea that there's a Black insurgency within the United States, kind of waging war, waging struggle internally. So people invite Eldridge Cleaver and the international section. He travels to North Korea, he travels to North Vietnam, and he travels to China and is part of delegations to visit on behalf of the Black Panther Party, to visit these kind of different movements. And they meet lots of different people. While they're in Algiers, they meet people from Congo Brazzaville. So Congo, after they gained independence, had a close relationship with the Soviet Union. But up until '68, the left wing of this kind of government decided it wasn't far enough, so they kind of waged basically a coup and installed a Marxist-Leninist Black Republic called the People's Republic of Congo. They find out about the Black Panthers in Algiers, and they want to invite them. And of course, Eldridge is thrilled to, rather than visit Asia, to visit other kind of Black Marxist-Leninists. This is his imaginary. And this is a time in early 1971 when there's a kind of a split, so-called, brewing between the West Coast, Oakland, Huey Newton-led Panthers, and people more in New York, which were kind of closer to Eldridge Cleaver. So because of this split, he views this kind of this entrance into going to Congo as the kind of future imaginary of what revolution of kind of vanguard liberatory politics will mean within the United States, and will also mean him kind of penetrating the split or emerging sort of victorious by demonstrating that the international section has maintained these kind of global links, and this will be the kind of revolutionary movement that'll include what was the Black Panthers. So they invite Bill Stevens, who they kind of meet through Paul and Carole Roussopoulas. They say, hey, you have to come, we're gonna go down to Congo Brazzaville and shoot this, make a film out of this. Another person who was on the trip, in addition to his wife, is Michael Sedewayo Tabor, who was part of the New York Panthers, and he ended up staying in Africa. He never came back, and I think he maybe passed in 2010, but he never came back. Another person that was part of the international section is Pete O'Neill, who's still in Africa, who also never came back. So there were a number of people who went to the international section in Algiers and stayed and never kind of went to prison. So Bill Stevens goes and they make the film. Another person who's part of the delegation is Denise Oliver, who was part of the Young Lords here in New York. And she kind of decided to leave the Young Lords and join Eldridge's faction of the Black Panther Party, which sort of would become the Black Liberation Army in some sense. In addition to the film, Kathleen gave me this book that they produced, or a little booklet, Message to the Afro-American People from the People's Republic of the Congo, which is basically the print version of the film. It includes a lot of transcripts of the interviews they did, a lot of essays by Eldridge Cleaver, essays by Sedewayo Tabor, et cetera, and of course photos that Bill Stevens took. So basically, one of the things that happens with the video equipment, they had video equipment in Algiers that they were experimenting with, but they didn't have the equipment to edit it. So they had to send the reels and the footage back to Paris to edit it. And Chris Marker, in his email, he said, we discovered a new way of editing film by phone. So Eldridge Cleaver was calling Chris Marker and telling him by phone what to do, how to cut it, what it should look like. So the film features a narration by Eldridge Cleaver, and Chris Marker is sort of editing with Paul and Carole Roussopoulas. But interestingly, for people who are more on the Chris Marker tip, we think it's one of the first experiences Chris Marker had editing video. He had primarily worked with 16mm film. He was famous for his kind of travelogues, you know, in Japan, China, etc. But he hadn't really worked with video, and throughout the 70s, he was doing a lot more collective projects, more kind of anonymous projects with groups he's starting in Paris, but also kind of an international sort of collaboration of sort of filmmakers, but it's primarily film. So this is really one of the first encounters he has with video, which is kind of just an interesting sort of phenomenon. Just lastly, maybe about the Congo. So in 68, 69 is when they declare this Marxist-Leninist Republic, and these filmmakers, or this delegation, is one of the first times that there's actually access for the West, so to speak, to come and document what's happening. It's one of the few documents that we really have of this moment of sort of African American that have been, you know, taken back to Africa. I think, you know, what they were actually trying to do is actually develop real solidarity and real links to what was happening in Africa and kind of the decolonial movements within Africa. So I think we shouldn't totally lose sight of that. And just to kind of finish, and you know, after the film's actually about 40 or 45 minutes, I think. So, you know, we'll have time to talk afterwards. But just quickly about whether or not the film's unfinished or not, I think it's in, you know, it shows up in certain catalogs in German and French that the film exists. Bill Stevens himself, there's citations of him showing it in Chicago in the 80s, and it may have been screened actually in New York with the Black Panthers, you know, informally in kind of a meeting setting. But the extent that the film is unfinished is that it was never really put to use, we could say. And if we think about, you know, what unfinished means versus, you know, things being put to use, it's a kind of different way of thinking about work or artwork or kind of things you produce or kind of revolutionary movements, a lot of which are unfinished, you know. I mean, so it's a different way of thinking. We went there. Obviously, we have this document or artifact of this trip that people kind of collaborated, an interesting convergence of people. So the extent to which it's unfinished, it's kind of open question, you know what I mean? I think it's unfinished, you know, part of that is up to us as kind of artists or filmmakers or political people. What would it mean to finish this film? I think we can maybe ask ourselves. So thanks a lot, Jake. Thanks for everyone for coming, and look forward to talking.